December 2nd, 1993. The city of Medellin held its breath. Police officers crouched behind walls, their weapons aimed toward a modest red brick house. Helicopters circled overhead, radios crackled with frantic voices. Every second felt like an hour. Inside that house was a man who had spent more than a decade making presidents tremble, judges disappear, and entire cities kneel before his power. For years, governments had hunted him. The United States wanted him. Colombia wanted him. His enemies wanted him. Even many of his former friends wanted him dead. Now, after 16 months on the run, the hunt was finally coming to an end. A figure burst from the rooftop. He was overweight, unshaven, exhausted. Not the larger-than-life king the world imagined. Just a man trying desperately to survive. Gunfire exploded across the neighborhood. Bullets ripped through the afternoon air. The figure stumbled, then fell. And just like that, the most powerful drug lord in history was gone. But to understand how Pablo Escobar ended up bleeding on a rooftop in Medellin, we must go back to a time before the billions of dollars, before the bombs, before the murders, before the cocaine empire, back to a poor boy who dreamed of becoming somebody, a boy who would eventually become the world's most wanted man. This is his story. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Wanted More. Long before the world knew his name, before governments spent billions trying to capture him, before newspapers called him the most dangerous criminal on earth, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was just a boy running through the dusty streets of Colombia. The year was 1949. Colombia was a country caught between beauty and violence. Towering mountains surrounded small villages. Farmers worked from sunrise to sunset. Children played soccer in dirt fields. But beneath the surface, political conflict and poverty were shaping the future of an entire generation. It was into this world that Pablo Escobar was born on December 1st, 1949. His father, Abel de Jesus Escobar, worked as a farmer. His mother, Hermilda Gaviria, was a schoolteacher who believed education could change a person's destiny. Like many parents, they dreamed of a better future for their children. But dreams were free. Reality was expensive. The Escobar family lived modestly. There was food on the table most days, but luxury was something they only heard about. Every peso mattered. Every expense had to be considered carefully. As a child, Pablo watched his parents work tirelessly. He watched his father return home exhausted from the fields. He watched his mother spend long hours teaching children who faced the same hardships their own family faced. Most children would have admired the hard work. Pablo saw something different. He saw struggle, and he hated it. One evening, when he was still a young boy, he sat beside his mother as she graded school papers under the dim light of a lamp. "Ma," he asked quietly. "Yes, Pablo?" "Why are some people rich and others poor?" His mother looked up from her papers. "Because life is not always fair," she answered. Pablo frowned. He didn't like that answer. "Then why don't poor people just become rich?" His mother smiled slightly. If it were that easy, everyone would do it. The young boy stared at the papers scattered across the table. Then, he said something that seemed insignificant at the time. "One day I'm going to be rich." His mother laughed softly. "We all say that when we're young." But Pablo wasn't joking, not even a little. As the years passed, his obsession with wealth grew stronger. While other boys talked about becoming soccer stars, doctors, or soldiers, Pablo's dreams revolved around money. Money represented freedom, power, respect, security. Most importantly, money meant never having to struggle again. His friends would later remember how often he talked about becoming wealthy. One childhood acquaintance recalled Pablo pointing toward a large house on a hill. "One day," Pablo said, "I'll own a house bigger than that." The other boys laughed. To them, it sounded impossible. To Pablo, it sounded inevitable. There was something unusual about him even then, an intense confidence, almost arrogance, a belief that the normal rules didn't apply to him. He wasn't the strongest child, he wasn't the smartest student, he wasn't the most athletic, but he possessed something far more dangerous, ambition without limits. By the time he reached his teenage years, Colombia was changing. The country was experiencing economic struggles and political instability. Opportunities were scarce, especially for poor young men. For many teenagers, the future looked predictable. Find work, earn little, struggle, repeat. Pablo refused to accept that future. He wanted more, much more. One afternoon, sitting with a group of friends near a roadside shop, the conversation turned toward their futures. One boy wanted to become a mechanic. Another hoped to work on a farm. A third planned to join a local business. Then, someone asked Pablo, "What about you?" The group looked at him. Pablo didn't hesitate. "I'm going to be a millionaire." The boys burst into laughter. "A millionaire?" one of them said. "Do you know how much money that is?" Pablo nodded. "Yes." "And how exactly are you going to make it?" A smile appeared on his face. "I don't know yet." The others laughed again. But Pablo wasn't embarrassed. He simply repeated himself. "I'll find a way." That statement would become the guiding principle of his life. He would always find a way. At first, the opportunities were small. He began selling items for profit. Sometimes he bought cheap goods and resold them. Sometimes the origins of those goods were questionable. Sometimes they were stolen. The money wasn't significant. But that wasn't the point. The point was learning. Every transaction taught him something. Every deal revealed another lesson. He began studying people, not from books, but from observation. He watched how they negotiated, how they lied, how they manipulated, how they reacted when they were desperate. And slowly, Pablo started understanding a truth that many people never learn. People are predictable. Everyone wants something. Everyone fears something. And those desires and fears can be used. One day, while helping move merchandise with a local contact, Pablo witnessed an argument between two men. The first man owed money. The second wanted payment. Voices rose. Threats followed. Eventually, the debtor handed over cash. The conflict ended immediately. As the men walked away, Pablo turned to an older associate. "Why did he pay?" The man shrugged. "Because he was afraid." Pablo thought about that answer for a long time. Fear. Such a simple thing. Yet it could make people do almost anything. Years later, that lesson would help him build an empire. But for now, he was just a teenager learning how the world worked. As his involvement in petty crime increased, so did his confidence. Each successful scheme made him bolder. Each small victory convinced him he was destined for something bigger. What set Pablo apart from other young criminals wasn't his willingness to break the law. There were countless young men doing the same thing. What made him different was his patience, his vision. Most criminals focused on surviving the week. Pablo was thinking years ahead. He wasn't interested in making quick money. He wanted extraordinary money, life-changing money, the kind of wealth that could transform not only his future, but entire cities. He didn't know exactly how he would achieve it. Not yet. But he was searching. Always searching. And somewhere beyond the mountains of Colombia, a new industry was beginning to emerge. An industry that would create unimaginable fortunes. An industry that would turn ambitious young men into kings. An industry built on white powder, cocaine. Pablo Escobar hadn't discovered it yet, but destiny was already moving toward him. And when those two forces finally collided, the world would never be the same again. Chapter 2. The First Steps into Darkness. By the early 1970s, Medellin was a city of contradictions. Its streets were alive with energy. Vendors filled the markets, buses rattled through crowded neighborhoods, music drifted from open windows. To outsiders, it looked like a city full of opportunity. But beneath the surface, another world existed. A hidden world, a world of smugglers, thieves, corrupt officials, and ambitious young men searching for shortcuts to wealth. For Pablo Escobar, this underground world became a university. The streets of Medellin became his classroom. Every crime taught him something. Every deal revealed another secret about human nature. Every risk made him bolder. By now, Pablo was no longer the boy dreaming about becoming rich. He was becoming a man determined to make it happen, no matter the cost. Every morning, he woke up with the same thought. Money. Not just enough to survive. Not enough to be comfortable. He wanted wealth on a scale few people could even imagine. The problem was that legitimate opportunities remained limited. Colombia was struggling economically. Jobs were scarce. Wages were low. For many young men, the path forward seemed hopeless. But Pablo had already decided something long ago. He would never allow poverty to define him. One afternoon, while sitting with several local associates in a small cafe, the conversation turned to business. One man complained about a failed smuggling run. Another cursed the police. A third worried about losing money. Pablo listened quietly. Then he leaned forward. "You're all thinking too small." The men looked at him. "What do you mean?" one asked. Pablo pointed toward the street outside. "Everybody here is fighting over scraps." The others exchanged confused glances. "What scraps?" "The little deals," Pablo said. "The small profits, the tiny opportunities." "And what's wrong with that?" Pablo smiled. "Because somewhere out there, somebody is making real money." The statement hung in the air. At the time, none of them fully understood what he meant. But Pablo was already beginning to think differently. He wasn't interested in surviving. He wanted domination. Over the next several years, he became increasingly involved in Medellin's criminal underworld. He transported illegal goods, helped coordinate smuggling operations, moved contraband across various routes, built relationships with criminals, businessmen, drivers, and corrupt officials. Each connection became another piece of a growing network. Each favor created a debt. Each debt created influence. Pablo understood something many people overlooked. Information was power. Relationships were power. Loyalty was power. The more people who depended on him, the stronger he became. Soon, his reputation began spreading. People described him as intelligent, bold, fearless, some even said reckless. But those who underestimated him often discovered something unsettling. Pablo was always watching, always learning, always calculating. One evening, while sharing drinks with several associates, an older smuggler laughed as he watched the young Escobar study a map. "What are you looking at?" the man asked. "Routes." "For what?" Pablo tapped the map. "Everything." The smuggler chuckled. "You're obsessed." Pablo looked up. "No." He pointed at the map again. "I'm preparing." The older man shook his head. "Preparing for what?" Pablo's answer came instantly. "The future." At the time, nobody knew exactly what future he meant, not even Pablo himself. But fate was already moving. A new market was emerging, a market unlike anything the criminal world had ever seen, and it would change everything. At first, cocaine wasn't considered the global phenomenon it would later become. It existed mostly in the shadows. A niche product, a luxury drug, something used by a relatively small number of people. But demand was growing, especially in the United States, and where demand existed, profit followed. The first time Pablo heard serious discussions about cocaine, he reportedly wasn't fascinated by the drug itself. He wasn't interested in its effects. He wasn't curious about the culture surrounding it. What interested him was the money. The numbers, the possibilities. One contact explained the economics to him during a late-night meeting. A kilogram can be bought for a few $1,000s. Pablo listened carefully. The man continued, and sold for much more. How much more? The man named a figure. Pablo raised an eyebrow. That's real? The man nodded. Very real. Silence filled the room. Pablo began doing the calculations in his head. 1 kilogram, then 10, then 100. The numbers quickly became unbelievable. Most people would have focused on the risks. Pablo focused on the profits. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that he had found the opportunity he had been searching for his entire life. A gold mine hidden in plain sight, a business with virtually limitless potential. That realization changed everything. Many people looked at cocaine and saw danger. Pablo saw an industry. Many people saw risk. Pablo saw scale. Many people saw crime. Pablo saw an empire. Over the following months, he immersed himself in the emerging trade. He met traffickers, observed operations, studied transportation routes, analyzed weaknesses, examined supply chains. The process fascinated him. Every aspect of the business offered room for expansion. Every inefficiency represented opportunity. Every competitor represented either a future ally or a future obstacle. His ambition exploded. Ordinary crime no longer interested him. Stealing cars felt insignificant. Small scams felt meaningless. Street-level operations seemed like children's games. He wanted something bigger, something historic, something that would make him richer than anyone around him could imagine. One night, while driving through Medellin, Pablo pulled his vehicle to the side of a hill overlooking the city. Lights stretched across the darkness. Thousands of homes, thousands of families, thousands of people sleeping peacefully. A friend sitting beside him noticed the unusual silence. "What are you thinking about?" Pablo stared at the city. "Everything." "What does that mean?" He pointed toward the lights. "All of this." The friend laughed. "The city?" Pablo nodded. "One day they'll all know who I am." The friend shook his head. "You dream too much." For a moment, Pablo didn't answer. Then he smiled. "No." His eyes remained fixed on the city below. "I dream exactly enough." At that moment, he was still far from becoming the most powerful drug trafficker in history. He had no private army, no billion-dollar fortune, no political influence, no empire. But something had changed. For the first time, he could see the path, and once Pablo Escobar saw a path to power, he pursued it with relentless determination. The cocaine trade was growing, the money was growing, the opportunities were growing, and so was Pablo. What began as curiosity would soon become obsession. What began as business would become a kingdom. And what began in the shadows of Medellin would eventually spread across continents. The young smuggler, standing at the edge of Colombia's criminal underworld, was about to become something far more dangerous. A king. A king whose empire would generate billions. A king whose decisions would shape nations. A king whose rise would leave thousands dead. The age of Pablo Escobar was about to begin, and the world wasn't ready for it. Chapter 3. Building the Cocaine Empire. By the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just another ambitious criminal trying to make money in Medellin. He had found his gold mine, and unlike the prospectors of old, he didn't have to dig into the earth to find it. His fortune came in small white packages, packages that would soon begin moving across borders, oceans, and continents, packages that would transform him from a local criminal into one of the richest men on earth. The cocaine trade was exploding. Demand in the United States was growing at a staggering pace. What had once been a niche drug used by a relatively small number of people was becoming increasingly popular among the wealthy, celebrities, business executives, and partygoers. And wherever demand existed, Pablo intended to dominate the supply. The opportunity was unlike anything he had ever seen. One evening, gathered around a table with several associates, Pablo listened as reports came in from different parts of the operation. A shipment had arrived safely. Another had crossed a border. A third was already generating profits. The numbers were astonishing. One of the men leaned back in disbelief. "We've made more money this month than we made all of last year." The room erupted with laughter. But Pablo didn't laugh. He was studying the figures, calculating, thinking, planning. Finally, one of the men asked him, "What are you looking at?" Pablo tapped the paper. "This. The profits?" "No." The man frowned. "What then?" Pablo looked around the room. "The limit." The others exchanged confused glances. "What limit?" Pablo smiled. "There isn't one." Silence followed. And in many ways he was right. The market seemed endless. The profits seemed endless. The possibilities seemed endless. From that moment forward, expansion became the only objective. The organization began growing at an astonishing rate. Traffickers joined the network. Pilots were recruited. Smugglers signed on. Financial experts helped hide money. Corrupt officials looked the other way. The operation spread like wildfire. Soon, routes stretched across South America. Aircraft flew under the cover of darkness. Small planes landed on hidden airstrips carved into remote jungles. Boats navigated secret waterways. Truck drivers transported cargo through carefully planned routes. Every person had a role. Every route served a purpose. Every shipment generated extraordinary profit. The system became a machine, and Pablo sat at the center of it, directing, expanding, growing stronger with every successful operation. At first, shipments were measured in kilograms, then hundreds of kilograms, then tons. The scale became almost impossible to comprehend. One pilot later recalled seeing enough cocaine loaded onto aircraft to fill entire warehouses. Every successful delivery fueled another. Every victory encouraged greater risk, and every risk brought greater rewards. Soon, money began flowing into Medellin at a pace nobody had ever witnessed. Cash arrived by the suitcase, by the truckload, by the warehouse. Stacks of currency piled higher and higher. There was so much money that traditional banking became nearly useless. Banks couldn't handle it. Accountants couldn't track it. Even counting it became a challenge. One day, a trusted associate entered a room where Pablo was reviewing reports. "We have a problem." Pablo looked up. "What kind of problem?" "We don't have enough places to store the money." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Pablo laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Imagine having so much money that hiding it becomes more difficult than earning it. Yet that was exactly the situation they faced. Warehouses were rented, properties were purchased, cash was hidden in walls, buried underground, stored inside secret compartments, stuffed into containers, moved constantly. Still, there was too much. Some estimates suggested the organization was earning millions of dollars every single day. The numbers became so enormous, they stopped feeling real. And then came one of the strangest problems of all. Rats. Millions of dollars in cash reportedly disappeared because rodents chewed through stacks of banknotes. When an associate informed Pablo about the losses, he simply shrugged. "How much?" The man named the figure. Most people would have been horrified. Pablo barely reacted. "Fine." "Fine?" "Make sure the rest is protected." That was it. The loss barely registered, because there was always more money arriving, always another shipment, always another payday. The machine never stopped. As the wealth grew, so did Pablo's reputation. Stories about him spread throughout Colombia. Some were true, many were exaggerated, but all of them contributed to a growing myth. People began speaking his name with a mixture of admiration and fear. In poor neighborhoods, some viewed him as a symbol of success, proof that a man from humble beginnings could conquer the world. Others saw something darker, a warning of what happens when ambition is allowed to grow unchecked. Neither side fully understood what Pablo was becoming, because he was no longer thinking like a criminal. He was thinking like an emperor. One evening, while standing on a balcony overlooking Medellin, Pablo watched the city lights flicker in the distance. A trusted associate approached. "You've done it." Pablo didn't turn around. "Done what?" "You became rich." For several moments, Pablo remained silent. Then he shook his head. "No." The associate looked confused. "No?" Pablo finally turned toward him. "This is only the beginning." The man laughed. "Only the beginning? You're already one of the richest men in Colombia." Pablo's expression remained serious. "Then I'll become the richest." The confidence in his voice was unsettling, not because it sounded arrogant, because it sounded inevitable. And for a time, it was. By the early 1980s, the Medellin cartel had become something the world had never seen before. A criminal organization operating on a scale that rivaled major corporations. Money flowed through its networks at astonishing speed. Its influence reached across borders. Its reach extended into politics, business, law enforcement, and society itself. At the center stood Pablo Escobar, the king, the boss, the man whose approval determined fortunes, the man whose anger could destroy lives, the man everyone answered to. His wealth reached levels that seemed almost fictional. Millions every month, hundreds of millions every year, eventually billions. More money than entire companies, more money than some governments, more money than he could ever spend. But wealth creates visibility. Visibility creates scrutiny, and scrutiny creates enemies. The bigger the empire became, the harder it became to hide. Governments started paying attention. Law enforcement agencies started asking questions. Politicians began discussing his growing influence. Journalists started investigating, and rivals watched closely. Some wanted a piece of his fortune. Others wanted to replace him. Many simply wanted him gone. For years, Pablo had been climbing toward unimaginable power. Now, he was approaching something equally inevitable: conflict. Because history has a rule: no empire grows forever, and no king rises without eventually creating enemies. The Medellin cartel had become a financial monster, a machine powered by fear, money, and ambition. But every monster eventually attracts hunters. And somewhere beyond Colombia's borders, powerful people were beginning to realize just how dangerous Pablo Escobar had become. The hunt had not yet begun, but the first shadows were already gathering, and with every dollar Pablo earned, he moved one step closer to disaster. Chapter 4. The King of Medellin. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar had achieved something most criminals could only dream of. He had money, more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, private estates, luxury vehicles, exotic animals, vast properties spread across Colombia. His empire was expanding faster than anyone thought possible. Yet despite all of it, something still bothered him. Money could buy almost anything, but it couldn't buy what he wanted most: love, respect, admiration. Pablo didn't want to be remembered as just another wealthy criminal. He wanted to be something bigger. He wanted people to see him as a hero, a man of the people, a leader, a savior. And unlike many powerful men who only talked about helping the poor, Pablo had something few politicians possessed: unlimited resources. One afternoon, while driving through one of Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, he looked out the window at rows of makeshift homes built from scrap materials. Children played barefoot in the dirt. Families struggled to survive. The roads were broken. The buildings were crumbling. Government assistance rarely reached places like this. A young boy approached his vehicle. The child couldn't have been older than 10. He stared through the window. Pablo lowered the glass. "What's your name?" he asked. "Carlos. Do you go to school?" The boy shook his head. "My family can't afford it." For a moment, Pablo looked around the neighborhood. Then he reached into his pocket and handed the boy money. The child's eyes widened. "Thank you, senor." Pablo smiled. As the vehicle drove away, he continued staring out the window. An idea was beginning to form, a very powerful idea. If the government wouldn't help these people, he would. And in return, they would never forget him. Soon, money began flowing into Medellin's poorest communities. Entire neighborhoods started seeing changes. Soccer fields appeared where empty lots once stood. Homes were built for struggling families. Food programs were established. Medical assistance became available. Community projects received funding. For many residents, the transformation felt miraculous. Years of neglect seemed to disappear almost overnight. One elderly resident later described the change. "Politicians promised things for years." She paused. "Pablo actually did them." That sentiment became increasingly common. People who had spent their lives feeling abandoned suddenly had someone paying attention, someone listening, someone helping. And that someone was Pablo Escobar. Word spread quickly. Every new project enhanced his reputation. Every family he helped created another loyal supporter. Every neighborhood improvement strengthened his influence. One evening, as workers completed construction on a community soccer field, children gathered excitedly around the entrance. The next morning, hundreds of people arrived. Parents watched from the sidelines, children raced across the field, laughter filled the air. For many families, it was the nicest facility they had ever seen. A local resident shook his head in disbelief. "Nobody else would have done this." Nearby, another man nodded. "The government forgot about us." But Pablo didn't. Those words would echo throughout Medellin. The government forgot about us. But Pablo didn't. It became one of the foundations of his popularity. Because while politicians often appeared during election seasons and vanished afterward, Pablo remained visible. He showed up. He handed out assistance. He funded projects. He listened to complaints. Whether his motives were genuine or strategic hardly mattered to the people receiving help. The results were real, and real results create loyalty. Soon, entire communities began treating him less like a criminal and more like a celebrity. Children ran toward his vehicles. Families gathered when he appeared. Crowds formed wherever he went. People wanted photographs, handshakes, conversations. Even a brief encounter became a treasured memory. One day, while visiting a housing project funded by his money, a woman approached him carrying her young daughter. Tears filled her eyes. "You gave us a home." Pablo smiled. The woman continued. "My family had nowhere to go." She looked around at the new buildings. "Now my daughter has a future." The crowd surrounding them applauded. For a moment, Pablo stood silently, not because he was uncomfortable, because he enjoyed it. The admiration, the gratitude, the sense of importance, it was intoxicating, perhaps even more intoxicating than money itself. As his popularity grew, stories about him spread across Colombia. Some were true, others became legends. People exaggerated his generosity, magnified his accomplishments, turned him into a larger-than-life figure. In many neighborhoods, his name became synonymous with opportunity. Some families even displayed his photograph inside their homes, not as a criminal, but as a benefactor, a protector, a symbol of hope. To outsiders, it seemed impossible. How could a man responsible for trafficking drugs be celebrated by so many people? The answer was complicated, because for many poor Colombians, life wasn't viewed through the lens of international politics or law enforcement. It was viewed through survival, and survival often creates different heroes. One local resident explained it perfectly. They call him a criminal. The man shrugged. Maybe he is. Then he pointed toward his neighborhood. But criminals didn't build this. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. To much of the world, Pablo Escobar was a ruthless drug trafficker growing richer by the day. To many people in Medellin, he was the first powerful person who had ever cared about them. Both perspectives contained truth, and Pablo understood exactly how valuable that contradiction could be. One evening, during a gathering with trusted associates, a discussion turned toward security. Government officials were becoming increasingly concerned about Escobar's growing influence. Investigations were expanding, questions were being asked, the risks were growing. One associate spoke nervously. "What happens if the government comes after us?" Pablo leaned back in his chair. "They will." The room fell silent. Another man asked, "Then what do we do?" Pablo smiled calmly. "We already did it." The men exchanged confused looks. "What do you mean?" Pablo pointed toward the city outside. "The people!" Slowly, understanding spread across the room. The houses, the neighborhoods, the projects, the assistance, the gifts, the favors. None of it had been random. It had all served a purpose. Because Pablo understood something many powerful men never fully grasp. Fear can force obedience, but gratitude creates loyalty. A frightened person obeys until they find an escape. A grateful person fights for you, defends you, protects you. And Pablo knew he would eventually need protection, a lot of it. Because beyond Medellin, forces were beginning to move. Government agencies were paying closer attention. International investigators were gathering information. Politicians were growing alarmed. Newspapers were publishing stories. Law enforcement officials were discussing strategies. The world was slowly awakening to the reality of what Pablo Escobar had become. Not merely a criminal, not merely a trafficker, but a man whose wealth and influence were becoming powerful enough to challenge governments themselves, and that frightened people, especially those in positions of power. By the mid-1980s, the warning signs were everywhere. The empire was growing too large. The profits were becoming impossible to ignore. The violence surrounding the drug trade was escalating. Pressure was building from every direction. Pablo could feel it. The authorities could feel it. Even his closest allies could feel it. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, it would plunge Colombia into one of the bloodiest periods in its history. The smiling crowds, the cheering children, the soccer fields, the celebrations. Those were only one side of the story. The darker side was still waiting, a side filled with assassinations, bombings, corruption, fear, and war, because the same man who could build homes for the poor could also destroy lives without hesitation. And soon, the world would see both faces of Pablo Escobar, the benefactor and the monster. The hunt was about to begin. And the bloodiest chapter of the Escobar story was still ahead. Chapter 5. Plata o Plomo. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar had become more than a drug trafficker, more than a wealthy criminal, and more than a local celebrity. He had become something far more dangerous, a man powerful enough to challenge the authority of an entire nation. For years, money had solved nearly every problem he encountered. A police officer needed convincing, money. A government official needed cooperation, money. A business owner required persuasion, money. But as Escobar's empire grew larger, not everyone could be bought. And for those people, Pablo had another solution, one that would become infamous across the world. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, money or bullets, a bribe or a coffin. The choice was brutally simple: take the money or face the consequences. The phrase spread through Colombia like a warning whispered in the dark. Judges heard it, police officers heard it, politicians heard it, journalists heard it. Some accepted the silver, others chose principle. Many of those people paid for that decision with their lives. One evening, inside a private meeting, a trusted associate informed Pablo that a government official was refusing cooperation. The official had rejected every offer, every payment, every attempt at persuasion. The associate looked nervous. "What do we do?" Pablo sat silently for a moment. Then he asked a single question. Did he understand the offer? Yes. And he refused? The associate nodded. Pablo's expression didn't change. Then he made his choice. The room fell silent. Everyone knew exactly what that meant. That was the terrifying reality of Escobar's world. Violence wasn't always his first option, but it was always available, and everyone knew it. Soon, fear spread throughout Colombia's institutions. A judge preparing a case against cartel members would glance over his shoulder before entering his home. A police officer investigating traffickers would worry about his family. Journalists who exposed corruption understood the risks of publishing certain stories. The threat didn't always need to be spoken. Its presence was enough. And Pablo understood the power of fear better than almost anyone. Fear could achieve results that money alone could not. One veteran police investigator later described the atmosphere. It felt like the cartel was everywhere. Everywhere. That single word captured the mood of the era. No one knew who could be trusted. No one knew who was secretly working for Escobar. No one knew who might be watching. The Medellin cartel's influence reached into every corner of society, and the deeper its roots grew, the harder it became to fight. Meanwhile, Escobar's wealth continued expanding at an astonishing pace. Millions became billions. Influence became power. Power became control, and control became confidence. Perhaps too much confidence. Because as Pablo's empire grew stronger, so did his belief that he was untouchable. One night, during a gathering at one of his properties, an associate voiced concerns. The government is getting more aggressive. Pablo poured himself a drink. They've always been aggressive. No, the man replied. This is different. Pablo looked at him. Different how? They're afraid of you. For a moment, a smile crossed Pablo's face. Then he nodded. Good. The associate hesitated. Why good? Pablo leaned forward. Because afraid people make mistakes. The statement revealed a great deal about how he viewed the world. To Pablo, fear wasn't merely a weapon. It was leverage, a tool, something that could be manipulated. And for a while, it worked. But fear has a dangerous side effect. Eventually, it creates resistance. The more violence spread, the more determined some people became to stop him. Government officials began organizing new strategies. Law enforcement agencies expanded investigations. International pressure increased. The United States became increasingly concerned about the growing flow of cocaine entering its borders. Escobar's name was now appearing in intelligence reports, newspaper headlines, and government meetings around the world. He was no longer a local problem. He had become an international threat. Yet, despite the growing pressure, the violence continued. Assassinations became alarmingly common. Public figures lived under constant threat. Entire cities felt trapped between fear and uncertainty. The situation worsened year after year. People began asking difficult questions. Could the government stop him? Could the police stop him? Could anyone stop him? For many Colombians, the answer seemed unclear, because every attempt to weaken Escobar appeared to reveal just how powerful he had become. One government official reportedly expressed the frustration felt by many. We're not fighting a criminal." He paused. "We're fighting an empire." And that empire possessed resources unlike anything law enforcement had encountered before: money, weapons, information, influence, loyal supporters, corrupt officials, private security forces. Entire networks dedicated to protecting one man. The challenge seemed almost impossible. As violence escalated, ordinary citizens suffered the consequences. Families worried about their safety. Businesses feared becoming collateral damage. Communities lived with uncertainty. Each new attack reinforced the sense that the country was losing control. The atmosphere grew darker, tenser, more dangerous, and still, Pablo Escobar remained at the center of it all. To his supporters, he was a champion. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. To the government, he was becoming the greatest challenge it had ever faced. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains surrounding Medellin, Pablo stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The lights below stretched endlessly into the darkness. A trusted associate approached him. "You've made a lot of enemies." Pablo didn't look away from the view. "That's what happens when you become powerful." The associate hesitated. "Some of them won't stop." Pablo nodded slowly. Neither man spoke for several moments. Then Pablo finally replied, "Neither will I." At that moment, he believed he could outlast anyone, outsmart anyone, and outfight anyone. But history was already moving against him. The violence had reached levels the government could no longer ignore. International pressure was increasing. Public outrage was growing. New alliances were forming. And somewhere inside government offices, military headquarters, and intelligence agencies, plans were being developed. Plans unlike anything Colombia had attempted before. Because the question facing the nation had become impossible to avoid. How do you stop a man with unlimited money? How do you stop a man who can buy loyalty? How do you stop a man protected by an army of supporters? How do you stop a man who seems larger than life itself? The answer would require extraordinary measures, years of effort, thousands of personnel, international cooperation, and one of the largest manhunts in modern history. The war against Pablo Escobar was about to enter a new phase. A phase that would transform Colombia forever. A phase that would eventually force the world's most wanted man into hiding. A phase that would end on a rooftop in Medellin. The rooftop where this story began.